Okay, let's get started with this podcast, IPPE Law Briefing Part 2 of 4. This is a very short podcast, but it is rather important. There are 3 parts. Part 1 about general information about dispensing medications. Part 2, which involves the structure of controlled substances law, and Part 3, which covers dispensing of controlled substances. This, in addition to 11 questions on our wiki, should get you started for your IPPE starting next week. Now, with dispensing medications, the first part of this podcast, I want to look at first over-the-counter versus prescription drugs. The most important thing a pharmacist does is dispense medications, so it is important that we look at the federal and state laws involved with the dispensing of medications. Let's focus first on Title 21 of the United States Code, Section 353 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This part of the Act became important as a result of the Durham-Humphrey Amendment that we've already talked about. You might remember the Durham-Humphrey Amendment was the amendment that distinguished between prescription drugs and non-prescription drugs, and we have a distinction here within this section. It's called the exemption section because it says exemptions in consideration for certain drugs, devices, and biological products. What is important here in subsection B is that we have the rules for distinguishing between prescription and over-the-counter drugs specified for us here. The way this part of the Act reads is a little unusual, but what it is telling us is that there are 3 ways in which a drug can be a prescription, with the default being that it is a drug that's over the counter. So we accept the idea that drugs are over the counter unless they are prescription. Let's look at the 3 ways in which a drug can be a prescription rather than an over-the-counter drug. Looking at 353b1, a drug intended for man which is habit forming, to which 502D applies. So then we go to section 502D, which is the misbranding section, and misbranding is the concept that applies to certain drugs in 502D if they are not labeled as being habit forming. There are specific drugs labeled in that section, and what this says is that drugs are prescription only drugs because they are habit forming. So that is one way a drug can be a prescription rather than an over-the-counter drug, being a habit-forming drug that is listed in Section 502 of the Act. Subsection C says because of its toxicity or other potentiality for harmful effects, or the method of its use, or the collateral measures to which use. And what they're talking about there is physical diagnosis. It is not safe for use except under the supervision of a practitioner licensed by law to administer such drugs. That is a general catch-all section which a decision can be made by the FDA that a particular drug is not capable of being labeled for safe and effective use without medical supervision. And if a product cannot be labeled for safe and effective use without medical supervision, then necessarily under this section of the law it becomes a prescription drug. So that is the second way that a drug can become a prescription rather than an over-the-counter. Now there is a third way, and that is under subsection C, where it is limited by the approved application of section 505, to which use under the professional supervision of a practitioner licensed by law to administer such drug. And this is under section 355, the new drug section. And what that means is If a drug is put on the market and that drug has been approved through a new drug application for prescription-only distribution, then it is prescription only rather than over-the-counter. So let's rehash now the 3 ways a drug can be a prescription rather than an over-the-counter. First of all, it can be habit-forming and listed under Section 502D. Secondly, it could be that a decision has been made that the drug is not capable of being labeled for safe and effective use without medical supervision. And thirdly, the drug could have been approved pursuant to a new drug application for prescription-only distribution, that it had not been approved for over-the-counter distribution, and if that is the case, then the drug will become a prescription rather than an over-the-counter. Let's talk briefly about transfer of prescriptions. So what is the significance of a drug being a prescription drug rather than an over-the-counter drug? Well, the law tells us here that such drugs shall be dispensed only, number one, upon a written prescription from a practitioner licensed by law to administer such drugs, or 2, upon an oral prescription of such practitioner which is reduced promptly to writing, or 3, by refilling any such written or oral prescription if such refilling is authorized by the prescriber either in the original prescription or by oral order that is reduced promptly to writing. So there are 3 ways a pharmacist can dispense a prescription for a prescription drug. One is pursuant to a written prescription. The second is pursuant to an oral prescription which is reduced to writing. And the third is pursuant to a refill authorization that is written in writing or orally. Now, times have changed since 1951 when this law was passed. We have facsimile prescriptions and we have electronic transfers of information from prescribers to pharmacies. The decision has been made that the modern ways of transferring prescription information from prescriber to pharmacist fits within at least the spirit, if not the literal meaning of this law. So there is no prohibition against that sort of transfer of information as long as certain restrictions are met. But there are limitations on the conveyance of information from a prescriber to a pharmacist. For example, the prescriber, like an MD, can't tell the patient, here's the drug I want you to have, go tell the pharmacist I have authorized you to receive this drug. And then the patient goes to the pharmacist and says, the doctor has given me the authority to have this drug. The pharmacist can't fill a prescription based on the patient having transmitted the information from the doctor to the pharmacist. The language of this act continues and says, the act of dispensing a drug contrary to the provisions of this paragraph shall be deemed to be an act which results in the drug being misbranded while held for sale. So when a pharmacist sells a prescription-only drug or distributes a prescription-only drug without a valid prescription, because, for example, the refills have run out, the pharmacist has rendered the product misbranded while held for sale. The pharmacist must have an authorization from a physician, like an MD. The second paragraph here, paragraph 2 under subparagraph B of section 353, specifies for us a requirement that a medication be labeled in a specific way. Remember, when we looked at section 353 and saw what the misbranding requirements are, we saw there where some affirmative disclosures requirements within it. And you well know that when a medication is dispensed to a patient with just a pharmacy label on it, doesn't have all full disclosure information. Well, how can that be that this is permitted? It is permitted under subsection 353b2. Because what that section says is a drug dispensed by filling or refilling a written or oral prescription is exempt from the requirements of Section 502 if the drug bears a label containing the name and address of the dispenser, the serial number and date of the prescription of its filling, the name of the prescriber, and it is stated in the prescription the name of the patient and the directions for use and cautionary statements, if there are any, contained in such a prescription. So those are the only requirements under federal law, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, for the labeling of a prescription-only medication. The pharmacist's initials are not required to be on there, well, at least in some states. The name of the drug is not required to be on there. Again, this is federal law we're talking about, not state law. The name of the patient isn't even required unless it's stated in the prescription. The directions for use and cautionary statements aren't required unless they are contained within the prescription. Again, this is federal law, not state law. You have to keep that distinction. I'm talking about federal law. Subsection 4 is interesting because it says that there is a particular labeling requirement, not for the vial that is dispensed by the pharmacist to the patient, but for the distributor of the stock bottle of medication distributed to the pharmacist. The stock bottle of medication has to bear this following statement: caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription. That is what is referred to as the federal legend, and that is why prescription-only drugs are referred to as legend drugs, because they contain this legend on their labeling. Now let's talk briefly about drug samples. Another important of Section 353 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is that there has some of the language from the Prescription Drug Marketing Act in it, and we talked about that last time. And one of these important sections that we need to make note of is subsection 1, which says no person may sell, purchase, or trade or offer to sell, purchase, or trade any drug samples for purposes of this paragraph in subsection D. The term drug sample means a unit of a drug subject to subsection B that is not intended to be sold but to be promote the sale of the drug. So essentially what that says is you can't sell samples. Now you know what samples are. Samples are drugs that are given to physicians in order to start patients out on a medication without requiring huge expenditures of money, because it could be that the drug is just not going to work very well. And if the drug doesn't work well, there is no sense in asking the patient to spend a great deal of money to buy a drug that will no longer he or she will no longer need. Having dispensed the drug can't be brought back into the pharmacy and redistributed to someone else, so it would be just a waste of drug if samples didn't occur. So the idea behind samples is that they make it possible to start a patient out on a new drug, and later, if that drug works, to write a prescription and continue the patient on that drug therapy. Unfortunately, what happened is that samples were being diverted from their normal distribution chain into other uses, and then back into the regular distribution chain. This law makes sure that this doesn't happen anymore. But note that drug sample is defined as a package that is not intended to be sold. So these rules do not technically apply to a stock bottle of medication that is used as a sample. Rather, what they apply to are samples that are intended originally to be samples. Now let's move on to the structure of controlled substances law. First, I'd like to talk about abusable controlled substances. In this part of the podcast, we can see that the way the law operates within certain particular drugs that are especially prone to abuse is that it creates an enclosed system within which those drugs must exist. Essentially, what this system does is to identify these special drugs. Special drugs that either have been abused or are potentially abusable drugs. And it says that these drugs are drugs that have particular significance from a law enforcement perspective. What is important to regulate all medications to assure that they are properly used, properly prescribed, properly dispensed, and properly administered to patients, meaning for all drugs. For these particular drugs, the consequences go far beyond healthcare consequences to include consequences that involve criminal justice authority. We call these controlled substances. Controlled substances are important to distinguish from legend drugs. Of course, in the classification that involves all medicinal drugs, there are some that are prescription only and there are some that are over the counter. This is a different sort of classification based not on a medical aspect of the drug, but based on a criminal aspect of the drug. That is, the potential or actuality of these drugs being diverted from an ordinary course of medical use to non-medical use, that is, for example, sold on the street to support an addictive habit of a drug addict. Now, many controlled substances have no medicinal use whatsoever, but there is another large group of drugs that are controlled substances that do have a medicinal use. So the purpose of controlled substances law, insofar as these special drugs are concerned, is to create a system within which they are to exist. The way the system works is to identify those drugs and to assign them to one of 5 schedules: Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, or Schedule 5. The system then says we are going to authorize certain people to possess drugs that are in one of those 5 schedules, and we are going to require record keeping from cradle to grave, from the synthesis and manufacture of the drug to their ultimate use by a patient. And at all times we are able to go in and examine the system and find who is the dispenser or a prescriber or a distributor or a manufacturer that has responsibility for these drugs, and examine the record keeping that they used in order to know whether the drugs were diverted to a non-medicinal use or non-medical use. So really, the 3 ways the system works, this closed system of controlled substance distribution, is that drugs to which the system applies are specifically identified. People who may possess the drugs within that system are registered, and record-keeping rules apply. So if there is a question that comes up about a controlled substance, it is possible to ask whether a person in possession of a controlled substance is one who is authorized to possess them. And the possession of a controlled substance without being a person authorized to possess a controlled substance is against the law. That would mean that the controlled substance has gone outside this closed system of distribution. Now, there may be some sort of question about whether a person is authorized, whether that person was a patient, for example, who received the medication dispensed by a pharmacist pursuant to a legitimate prescription. That question should be answerable by going to the pharmacy and examining the record keeping that the pharmacy has on hand and determining whether or not the patient's name is on a prescription. So the whole point is accountability, being able to show where these very special drugs have gone at any particular time and being able to answer the question accurately. Does this particular person have the authority within this controlled system to possess this controlled substance? And if the answer is no, then the law has been broken. Let's switch now to the classification of controlled substances. Take a look at Title 21, United States Code, Section 812, if you have a chance. It describes the schedules of controlled substances. As I said, there are schedules 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. For our purposes, it's pretty easy to really focus on Schedule 2, combine Schedule 3 and 4, and Schedule 5. The reason for that is Schedule 1 drugs you hardly ever see in a pharmacy, and from a dispenser's perspective, Schedule 3 and 4 are treated pretty much the same. So even though we have 5 different schedules, we really only have 3 different sets of rules that are important for the drugs within these 5 schedules. Schedule 1 drugs are drugs that currently have no recognized legitimate medical purpose. And as I said, you usually don't see those in a pharmacy. When might you see them in a pharmacy? Well, it would have to be a drug that is being used for investigational purposes, a drug that currently has no legitimate medical use that is recognized within the scientific community. It is proposed perhaps to have a legitimate medical use, and because of this proposal, clinical trials are being undertaken to determine whether the drug is safe and effective for a legitimate medical purpose. During that period of time when these clinical trials are being done to examine whether the drug has a legitimate medical purpose, the drug would have to be available. You can't do a clinical trial when the drug is not available. So during that period of time and under very restrictive circumstances, Schedule 1 drugs would be available, usually in a hospital setting and very highly controlled. Schedule 2 drugs are those with a high potential for abuse and yet have a recognized legitimate medical use. Of those controlled substances that are generally available for use, Schedule 2 drugs are those that are most highly restricted. And we have a number of specific requirements that it will be important in the next section to focus on with regard to Schedule 2 drugs. Bear in mind that Schedule 2 drugs are the most likely to have these special rules applicable to them. You might be wondering, do I have to memorize the names of all the drugs in Schedule 2? And the answer is no, you really don't have to, because labeling requirements for Schedule 2 drugs specify that on the label the written, printed, or graphic material affixed to the immediate container the letter C with a dash and a 2, C-2, or a big C with a Roman numeral 2 within it must appear. And it has to be of a sufficient size that you can see it and identify it as being a Schedule 2 drug. So although you will probably come to know very quickly what the Schedule 2 drugs are, you don't necessarily have to memorize that list, because anytime you go to a stock bottle of a medication to dispense it, you will see it on the stock bottle that the C2 insignia is present, and you will know, aha, there are special rules. We will learn more about those special rules in the next section, but they have to do with the rule against dispensing a refill supply. Rules concerning partial filling and others we'll get to later in this podcast. Schedule 3 and 4 are treated the same way from a dispenser's point of view. And again, you don't have to remember what drugs are in that are in Schedule 3 and 4, but make sure to take a look at the label of the medication you dispense, and if it says Schedule 3, Roman numeral 3, or Roman numeral 4, then it will have a big C with either a Roman numeral 3 or a Roman numeral 4 within it, or a C with a dash and a Roman numeral 3 or a Roman numeral 4 after it. If it says on the label in any way you can see it, it will be conspicuously enough you can see it, then you will know that it is Schedule 3 or Schedule 4. These drugs have a lesser potential. for abuse than Schedule II drugs and have a legitimate medical purpose, and they are very frequently used. The regulations and restrictions on these drugs are much less so than they are for Schedule II drugs, so it is not quite as important to make a mental note of these and be extremely cautious about them. But don't let me mislead you into thinking that controlling these drugs isn't important. It is. And from a policeman function that the people who enforce controlled substances laws view, these drugs that perhaps are just as important for Schedule 3 and 4, they not be diverted as for Schedule 2. Quite a few pharmacists have gotten into trouble over Schedule 3 and 4 drugs, so I don't want to downplay the importance of these drugs. Schedule 5 drugs are among the controlled substances least possible to abuse, and they also have a legitimate medical purpose. There are many Schedule 5 drugs that were on the market until very recently and no longer are, so the classification of Schedule 5 is not as important as it once was. There used to be a large number of drugs that were Schedule 5 and yet non-legend drugs. So in other words, they were controlled substances, but they were not prescription-only drugs. It was a fairly large category of drugs, including cough syrups containing codeine and anti-diarrheal medications containing opium. And there are restrictions of the sale of these drugs, many of which are no longer in the market. So the importance of that particular aspect of Schedule 5 is not as great as it once was. There are some drugs in Schedule 5 that are prescription-only drugs, so it is still important to be aware of the restrictions that apply to Schedule 5, but it is not as important as those drugs once were. Now let's look at the registration requirements involving controlled substances. How about the requirements for the registration of people? The way the system works is to classify the drug and then also to require that the people who are authorized to possess the drug at the time to be registered. Registration has to be with the DEA, that is the Drug Enforcement Administration. Now most of the people who handle controlled substances are licensed by the state, but that is a separate matter from the registration with the DEA. And you can see in Title 21 of the United States Code, Section 822, if you read it or look online, that the persons required to register are specified. It says every person who manufactures or distributes any controlled substance or List 1 chemical, and you really don't have to worry about what a List 1 chemical is, or who proposes to engage in the manufacture or distribution of any controlled substance or List 1 chemical, shall obtain annually a registration issued by the Attorney General in accordance with the rules and regulations promulgated by him or her. This section continues to describe who it is that needs to be registered with the DEA, including in subsection 2 the requirement that every person who dispenses must register with the DEA. So that might make it seem that pharmacists, since pharmacists are dispensers, must register with the DEA, but in subsection C we see that there are some exceptions. And the law says the following persons shall not be required to register and may lawfully possess any controlled substance or List 1 chemical under this title. And what that says is any agent or employee of any registered manufacturer, distributor, or dispenser of any controlled substance or List 1 chemical. Well, most pharmacists who handle controlled substances are employees of a pharmacy that is registered as a dispenser of controlled substances. And if a pharmacist who handles controlled substances is an employee of a pharmacy that is registered, then the pharmacist need not register. Another thing that is included as an exception to subsection 3 that says that an ultimate user who possesses such substances for a purpose specified in section 102 and that there is a therapeutic purpose need not register. So patients don't have to register with the DEA. Patients who have received controlled substances pursuant to a legitimate prescription for a medical purpose are not required to register with the DEA. Another interesting aspect of this registration requirement is that a separate registration is required for each activity. So a pharmacist might engage in both the distributing of drugs to another licensee, another registrant, or a pharmacy might manufacture or compound. And what is important in controlled substance law in terms of registration is not your identity or your professional license, but the activity in which you are engaging. If you're a pharmacy, but you are engaging in distributive activities, in other words, you are distributing drugs not just to patients pursuant to a prescription, but to other registrants, that is, other pharmacies, and acting sort of as a small wholesaler, then you have a responsibility to register as a distributor. There is a separate registration that depends on that activity, not your identity. Another example that I just mentioned would be the compounding of medications. Now, compounding is regulated by the DEA in addition to being regulated by the FDA, but the way they approach it is very different. DEA regulations simply say that if you're going to compound, then you have to register as a compounder, and you have to keep certain records of that compounding. You do with controlled substances. FDA regulation of compounding is much more complicated than that. But the DEA regulation is important nonetheless, because what the DEA says is to the extent that you are compounding, it doesn't matter if you are a dispenser and you are registered as a dispenser, you must register as a compounder also. The requirement for registration depends not on your identity, but on the activity in which you are engaging. Now let's switch briefly to dispensing controlled substances. First, look at the closed system of distribution of controlled substances. Here is where we talk about things physicians and pharmacists have to do within the closed system of the distribution of controlled substances. If you were to look at the federal code, that is Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, you would see the first section that we are going to examine is section 1306.03. These are regulations from the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration. This section says a couple of interesting things. First of all, a prescription for a controlled substance may be issued only by an individual practitioner who is 1. Authorized to prescribe controlled substances by the jurisdiction in which he is licensed to practice his profession or her profession, and 2, he or she is registered or exempted from registration pursuant to the chapter. So what that means is that the prescriber of controlled substances has to meet 2 requirements. First of all, the prescriber has to be licensed by the state, like here in New York. And secondly, the prescriber has to be registered by the DEA. Both the state and the DEA give numbers to those who are either licensed or registered. And for a pharmacist to verify that a prescriber is both licensed and registered, it might be necessary to ask for the state license number or the federal DEA registration number. The same section also says that a prescription issued by an individual practitioner may be communicated to a pharmacist by an employee or agent of the individual practitioner. So when an individual practitioner issues a prescription, authorizing the dispensing of a controlled substance that can only be done by the practitioner. But communicating information to the pharmacist is something about that prescription that an agent can do. The agent could be a nurse, an office assistant, or even a clerk. Anyone may act as an agent of the prescriber in communicating information to the pharmacist. When we get to later sections of this course, we'll be talking about the receipt of information in the pharmacy by either a pharmacy intern or a pharmacist. Actually, we'll talk about that in the wiki section. Section 1306.04 is a very important section of the DEA rules and regulations. Purpose of issue of a prescription. What it tells us is the pharmacists have a corresponding responsibility with that of the physician to assure that a prescription has been issued for a legitimate medical purpose. That's something you will see in the multi-state pharmacy jurisprudence exam. It says that a prescription for a controlled substance to be effective must be issued for a legitimate medical purpose by an individual practitioner acting in the usual course of his or her professional practice. Responsibility for the proper prescribing and dispensing of controlled substances is upon the prescribing practitioner, but a corresponding responsibility rests with the pharmacist who fills the prescription. What is corresponding responsibility? It is to recognize an order purporting to be a prescription issued not in the usual course of professional treatment or in legitimate and authorized research. Having recognized that the pharmacist's responsibility is not fill what is purported prescription, but not really a prescription at all, it continues to say that a person knowingly filling such a purported prescription has violated the law. They think it's not legitimate and they go ahead and fill it anyway. That is a violation of the law. Section B of 1306.04 tells us that a physician cannot obtain controlled substances for office use using a prescription. Instead, what the physician has to do is invoice the pharmacy to acquire them through an invoice rather than a prescription, since a prescription may not be used in order for an individual practitioner to obtain his controlled substances for supplying the individual practitioner for the purpose of general dispensing to patients. So if you have a doctor's office, and within that doctor's office, a doctor wants to use controlled substances to dispense to patients or administer to patients, the way to acquire them is by using an invoice within a pharmacy, not by writing a prescription. Prescriptions are intended for individual patients, not for general office use. Finally, manner of issuance of controlled substances prescriptions. This is in section 1306.05, and this tells us the requirements, the requisites, the formality of a prescription. All prescriptions for controlled substances shall be dated as of and signed on the day when issued. They shall bear the full name and address of the patient, the name, strength, dosage form, quantity prescribed, directions for use, and the name, address, and registration number of the practitioner. All that information is required to be on a prescription issued by a practitioner for a controlled substance. It also continues to tell us that where an order is not permitted, a prescription shall be issued in ink or indelible pencil or typewriter. That is kind of interesting, isn't it? Indelible pencil, something I haven't seen for quite a while, if I've ever seen it at all. Now at the bottom of that paragraph, the DEA says a corresponding liability rests upon the pharmacist who fills a prescription not prepared in the form prescribed by these regulations. So a pharmacist has a corresponding responsibility to assure that a prescription has been issued for a legitimate medical purpose and a corresponding liability if a prescription doesn't meet the formal requisites, if it doesn't have specific requirements that have been met for the content of the prescription. Let's go down to section 1306.06. That tells us the person's entitled to fill prescriptions. What it says is that a prescription for controlled substances may be filled only by a pharmacist acting in the usual course of his or her professional practice and either registered individually or employed in a registered pharmacy or a registered institutional practitioner. So what they are talking about is a pharmacist doesn't necessarily have to have a DEA number, a DEA registration. But if the pharmacist doesn't have one, then the pharmacist has to be working for a pharmacy that is registered with the DEA and has a DEA registration. Let's look at 21 CFR 1306.11. This is the first section to deal with Schedule II drug controlled substances. If you recall, Schedule II controlled substances are the most highly restricted of those controlled substances that are generally available within a pharmacy. Schedule I controlled substances are going to be available pursuant to some sort of investigational use because they are not generally recognized as having legitimate medical use in the United States. Schedule II controlled substances do have a recognized medical use, yet their potential for abuse is so high that they are highly restricted. Oftentimes the problems pharmacists get into with controlled substances are in the area of Schedule II controlled substances. So it is important for us to focus on this particular area of controlled substances law, the area dealing with Schedule II controlled substances. The requirement of a prescription is the basic issue here. A pharmacist may dispense directly a controlled substance listed in Schedule II, which is a prescription drug determined under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, only pursuant to a written prescription signed by the practitioner. So that is our basic general rule. Schedule II prescriptions cannot be authorized orally. They have to be dispensed pursuant to a written prescription. We do have some exceptions, and as you can see, one of the exceptions that is discussed right within this section is facsimile transmission. A prescription for a Schedule II controlled substances may be transmitted by the practitioner or the practitioner's agent to a pharmacy via facsimile equipment, provided that the oral, written, signed prescription is presented to the pharmacist for review prior to the actual dispensing of the controlled substance. A couple of interesting things to note here. First of all, this does not authorize a patient or somebody other than in the pharmacy's office to fax a prescription for a Schedule II to a pharmacy. What it authorizes is facsimile transmission of Schedule II prescriptions from a prescriber's office directly to a pharmacy. And that ends the podcast for this IPPE Law Briefing number 2.